Welcome to our class on Mora Nevuchem, on Guide for the Perplexed or Guide of the Perplexed. And I think this is lecture 98, I think. And if I'm wrong, that's fine, whatever. But and we just finished last week chapter 13 in part 3. And for those, there's page 456 in the Shlomo Pines version. We're about to start chapter 14. I did make a promise last week. I got a little that I would explain a little bit the ending of the previous chapter. So I should start there. And so we really, let's turn back to 455. Thus it is made clear. But I'm going to actually, instead of reading that paragraph, which I read last time, but I kind of did a couple points that I didn't catch, I'm going to paraphrase it in my own words. So the Rambam there is actually discussing several psukim in the book of Eov, in the book of Job, Eov. And the one is from Eov Perek Daled, where it says, Hein be'avadav lo ya'amin, which can roughly translate as, behold, the God does not trust in his servants, uv'malachav, and in his angels, yasim tahala. He finds flaws. Af shochne batei chomer. So, in other words, if that's the case with God's angels, then the next verse reads, Af shochne batei chomer, asher, then those who, so how much more so those that reside in houses made of clay, in other words, made of dirt, asher ba'afar yisodam, that those, in other words, human beings, their foundation is made of dirt, yidak lifnei ash, and they are just crushed in front of like a moth, the flying kind of moth. So there's various ways to translate that verse, but that's the basics. And then he also went to another verse, which is in Eov Perek Tes Vav, verse 15 and 16. So it says again, it says Hein bikdoshav lo ya'amin. It's similar language to before, but this time he uses the language Hein bikdoshav, and before it was Hein ba'avadav, right? So Hein bikdo, God has no trust in his holy ones. V'shamayim lo zaku ve'enoi ve'enav, and even the heavens are not pure in his eyes. Af ki nitzaven elach. Behold, how much more so is the human being who is disgusting and small. Ish soshek kamayim avlo, the person drinks iniquity or sin like water. So the bottom line of that last paragraph was the Rambam said that who are these kedoshav, who are these avadav, who are these malachav, these high lofty ones? They are, as Rambam has repeatedly stated many times, the spheres of the heavens and the intelligences, so to speak, that run those spheres. Hold on, I got to plug in my computer before I lose power. I'm sorry. About to go dead. All right, this is better. And what God is saying, what the verses are saying there, according to Rambam, is that b'kedoshav lo ya'amin, God has no. When he says that he has no trust in his angels, what he means is because they're physical created beings, right? Those angels that are lofty and high are created beings, are created of substance, right? Of some sort of substance, just like we are. And even those intelligences of the angels that run those spheres that rotate around the world are also created beings. So they're not permanent. They don't exist. In other words, if you took Aristotle's idea, right, which was what modern scientists, an atheist scientist would say, right, that things exist because the laws of nature dictate that that's how it should be, right? So then all of those beings, the spheres that rotate around the Earth, right, would be there because they have to be there because the rules of nature dictate that that's how they should be, like Aristotle would have said as well. So, but Rambam is saying, no, all of those things are created, right? So, and they're lofty, high things up there, right? And even those are nothing before God. And we, who are so small and tiny in comparison to them, right? Both in terms of our level of intellect and in terms of our level of the kind of matter that we're made up of, are so puny and so small and physically measurably small. How much more so are we nothing, right? Are we? And then emphasizing then therefore, and he's going to emphasize it, continue into this in the chapter we're about to start today, Therefore, it can't possibly be we are not the purpose of the universe, right? The human being, as small as we are not the purpose of the universe. Now, so the Rambam, said that emphatically throughout chapter 13, which we spent the last 2 weeks on. He's going to continue on the topic in chapter 14. However, I want to mention that the Rambam he's devoting 2 chapters and 2 long chapters to this idea, in large part because he's refuting, right, a very prevalent idea among religious philosophers. Okay, so and specifically, he's attacking Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, who writes in Emunus Judaeos. So Sadia Gaon lived like a couple centuries before the Rambam, and he was the first major Jewish scholar to write a book on Jewish philosophy, and that was his Sefer Emunus Judaeos. In there, he posits that the purpose of creation is for the human being to use it in order to worship God. And I'm sure that pretty much all of people listening here today, and whoever listens to the recording, has heard that being stated at some point in their lifetime of listening to religious discourses, that the Rambam is attacking that idea, directly attacking that idea, and he's attacking Sadia Gaon. And also, another famous book that preceded the Rambam, although I don't think the Rambam, if he was aware of it, I don't know if there's any place where he quotes it. It's the famous Chovot HaLevavot, or the Duties of the Heart, written by Bachya ibn Pekuda, who died just a decade or so before the Rambam was born, in the same region of Spain. So it's, I don't know, and he was also well, to some degree, an Aristotelian or Neoplatonist, whatever. But Bachya ibn Pekuda wrote Duties of the Heart, which is one of the first major works on Jewish ethics and how to live a moral life. But it's also a work of philosophy. And in that book, Rabbeinu Bachya takes the position also that the world is here to serve man, and the purpose of all of the kingdoms, the animals, plants, and so on, is here to serve us, right? So that we can use it to serve God. And so the Rambam is stating that can't possibly be the case, right? The world is here for its own purpose. Every being has a purpose. And God created a world so that every single thing that's within the world should fulfill its purpose. Okay, and this is I also have a couple of articles, really, much more modern articles, people that write on things like modern ideas of ecology and animal rights and things like that, use these ideas of the Rambam as a foundation, as a Jewish foundation for the ideas of respecting the world around us, that the world isn't here. And Rambam directly refuted, as we read together, that when it says, that we should dominate the earth, it doesn't mean that we dominate it because it's here for our purpose, but rather it means that that's what human beings can do, but not that we should do, right? We all studied that together. So I wanted to mention that, but now let's do chapter 14. I hope we can do 15 tonight as well, because I prepared a lot of cool stuff for 15. But let's see, 14. So page 456. What man ought also to consider in order to know what his own soul is worth, and to make no mistake regarding this point. In other words, be humble. Know what your true worth is, the Rambam says. Keep this in mind. Is what has been made clear concerning the dimensions of the spheres and of the stars and the measures of the distance separating us from them. So the Rambam is going to say, and I'm going to go through this quick because this is long defunct science, but which I want to bring out, the point is very relevant today, but the actual science and the measurements. So he first starts by saying the distances between the diameter of the Earth, the distance to the sphere of Saturn, which I don't remember which one its sphere of Saturn is, but it's whatever sphere in his cosmology the planet Saturn rotated in. And it's how many days it is. In other words, how many days it would take to walk the distance, and so on. I skipped a couple sentences, and then he quotes the verse again from Eov. The Rambam loved the Sefer Eov. He quotes from it a lot. And is God not in the height of heaven? Is not God in the height of heaven? And behold, the topmost of the stars, how high they are. In other words, look how high, how elevated God is. So this means, can you not draw? And then I'm reading at the bottom of the page. Can you not draw from the height of heaven a conclusion as to the remoteness of the apprehension of the deity? Right? Just look at the heaven and look at its simple vastness. Now, the Rambam made a measurement, which we know today, the size of the universe is gazillions, I mean, times more than he knew, right? So the relevance of the lesson is, if anything, greater today, right, than it was back then, right? He's saying if we are at such an extreme remoteness, if we're so far from Saturn, right, and so that its substance and most of its actions, we don't even understand what it's made of, what it does, why it does, right? How much more does that apply to God himself, who is not even a body, who is so beyond our comprehension? This great distance, and I'm at the top of 457, that has been demonstrated is only a minimum. It is not possible that the distance between the center of the Earth and a fixed star is to be less, but it could be many times greater. In other words, the measurements that I said, based on his current knowledge of astronomy, he says this is what we calculate to be the minimum distance, but we don't really know. It really might be much more, right? So Rambam, when we mentioned this many times, fully understood that scientific knowledge can advance, right? And he always leaves this little thing, is right, because if the thickness of the spheres has only been demonstrated for its minimum possible dimensions, and so on. If you want to read the books about distances, the reading from the epistles concerning distances, certainly it's impossible to determine exactly the thickness, according to, and he quotes Thabit, one of the astronomers of those days. Reasoning forces us to admit between every two spheres. For in these bodies there are, so I'm just kind of going through this. This is known for the measure of some of the stars. It's possible that it's even greater. The ninth sphere, which is the highest sphere, its dimension isn't even known at all because there's no star in it. Consequently, we have no way to measure it. So consider how vast and are the dimensions. So the Rambam is really leaving place for modern science here and saying that it might be way vaster than we even know, right? And as we know now, it is, right? So how can one of us imagine? So this is the final sentence, and this is very relevant. The last sentence of this paragraph on 457: if the whole of the earth would not constitute even the smallest part of the sphere of the fixed stars, in other words, the size of the entire planet that we live on is a teeny, teeny, tiny nothing in comparison to the size of the universe we see around us, right? What is the relation of the human species to all these creation things? In other words, we are just a tiny piece of this planet, right? And how can one of us imagine that they exist for his sake? How could we have the chutzpah and not to think that we exist, that all this exists just for the tiny, tiny, tiny little us on this tiny, tiny, tiny little planet, right? And because of him, and that they are instruments for his benefit, and everything on this world and in this universe is here for us? How could you imagine such a thing? That's what the Rambam is saying here, right? It's an instrument for our own humility, right? To understand that we're a tiny nothing in comparison to the universe, and to think that we're the purpose, it would be a tremendously arrogant thing to think. So then he goes on and he says, and remember, this is the second chapter, and he's attacking this idea, which is a very established idea in Jewish thought. I just quoted two of the greatest Jewish philosophers that disagreed with the Rambam on this, but Rambam is banging this point in because he's taking a very strong stance on this idea. This is the state of things when the bodies are compared, right? When we compare us to remember, he thought of the spheres of the stars as bodies. They're things, right? They're spheres within which the stars are embedded. How then, when you think about the existence of the intellects, remember, in Aristotelian physics, in order for something to move, there has to be a mind, an intellect, saying move, right? Because that's how he imagined, well, how do we make our body move? By thinking, move, right? I think, walk to the store, and I walk to the store, right? So the intellects, right, which the Rambam identifies as angels, that decide and say to these spheres and the stars in the heavens, go, right, and make them move. How much more incredibly sophisticated or powerful or perfect they are than we, right? Sometimes doubts are expressed concerning the opinion of the philosophers in this matter. It is said, if we claim that the final end of the spheres consists in the governance of, for instance, a human individual or several individuals. So some people think like this, right? If you say, it doesn't make sense to say that all those spheres exist so that me, Saul Weinreb, should exist. That's a little bit arrogant. But, however, in as much as we think of that, they're final, if it governs the human species, but all of humanity, okay, that's important. Maybe the whole universe exists for all of humanity. Maybe that's not so arrogant to think that way. Maybe that's possible, right? There is no absurdity in thinking that the final end of this great individual bodies is the existence of the individuals of the various species, the number of which individuals cannot, according to their doctrine, ever have an end. Because remember, the people thinking this are Aristotelians, think that humans have always been and will always be. So there's an infinite number of human beings. So maybe it all exists for that. It would resemble a case of an artisan. He says, you have iron tools weighing 100 whatever pounds or whatever the measurement is, right? And he uses all of those tools to make a tiny needle, right? So if it was done for the sake of one needle, this would have been bad management from a certain speculator. In other words, as a business decision, that's quite dumb. You have this huge amount of equipment to make a needle, right? However, but in view of the fact that with these tools, he manufactures one after another and thus several hundred weights of needles, then it makes a good sense. It's good management. In other words, you made a bazillion needles, now you sold it and you made a lot of money. It makes sense, right? Similarly, the final end of the spheres, right, consists in the continuance of coming to be and passing away. All of it makes the world continue to go on, and all the species and the human species to constantly come into existence, right? And we can find texts and traditions that support this imagining. I can show you, and Rambam is hinting that you can find verses in the Torah and Chazal that seem to suggest that this is correct. And he's not going to bring those things. But however, I'm starting the second paragraph on 458, the philosopher will resolve the doubt by saying, if the difference between the bodies of the spheres and the individuals that are subject to generation and corruption, right, had only consisted in their bigness and smallness, then you can say this objection, right? You can say that, you know what, everything does exist for human beings. The fact that the spheres are so much larger than us, in other words, when you measure them, in other words, the universe is so huge and we're so tiny, so that doesn't prove anything because there's an infinite number of humans. Humans always existed, always will exist, and there's 100 million of us now, there's 100 billion of us in 10 years from now, and 20 years and 20,000 years, right? So if you add all the humans, there's a lot. So that you can kind of get away with that. Then you might have a logical way out. However, seeing the difference between them concerning the nobleness of substance, the greatness, the awesome power and might that exists, that is the universe. Today, we wouldn't call it necessarily the intellects, right? Remember, what we see as moving the world and making the universe, so to speak, move. We see all of the forces of nature, the incredible amount of force of nature that a tiny little atomic particle has contained within it, right? And you compare that with our puny little selves, the entire mass and power of the entire universe. To say that would be, as the Rambam says, it would have been most disgraceful if what is nobler served as an instrument for the existence of what is most base and vile. Okay, that's the end of that second chapter. In other words, we're in his words, we're base and vile. To think that all of this exists for us just doesn't work. It doesn't hold up. Okay, to sum up, this doubt, and the end of this chapter ends in something really cool too. So this is a really good one. This doubt may be called upon to help us in our belief concerning the production of the world in time, which notion was my main object in this chapter. The fact is that I believe the world was created, right? And it was created so that the entire universe should exist exactly the way it exists. Every single thing was made so that it should exist. You and I were made so that you and I should exist, but so was my cat, and so was the cow marching around the field, and so was the lion in Africa, right? They were all made so that they should exist, right? And besides, there is the fact that I've always heard from all those who have some smattering of knowledge of the science of astronomy that what Chazal said, right, regarding distances are exaggerated. So he goes from this sentence. Besides, he goes off on a little tangent, which is really interesting. But there's also, I want to mention something else Rambam says. Besides, there is this fact, right, that if you look through Chazal, they have clearly stated, and I'm going to just really paraphrase. You can go through the rest of the chapter yourself. He brings their distances, Chazal's distances, right? And they measure different distances than I did when I was quoting the current modern, in Rambam's day, modern astronomical treatises that he quoted from that calculated the distances in the stars. I must skip that part mostly too, right? But when you look through Chazal, they had different measurements. So I'm going up to the top of page 459. So I'm just going to read. Do not ask me to show. This is the beginning of the second paragraph on 459, the last paragraph of chapter 14. So people will argue with me and say, you just told me the distances are like this, but Chazal, in the Gemara, you find different distances measured. So one point that he made is, it doesn't matter. The point is the same. Chazal's distances were greater than the distances that he measured, right? But the point, the idea that he taught doesn't change according to Chazal. But then again, don't bother me, the Rambam is about to state, with the fact that my modern science contradicts what's written in the Gemara, right? Don't bother me with such nonsense because of the following. For at that time of Chazal, mathematics was imperfect. Were imperfect, right? Their math that they had access to in the time of the Gemara wasn't as good as our math, right? They did not speak about this as transmitters of dicta of the prophets. When Chazal taught us the distances of their astronomical measurements, they were not teaching us what they learned out of the Torah or the Tanakh, but rather because in those times they were men of knowledge in these fields, and they knew astronomy based on their times, right? Or because they had heard these dicta from the men of knowledge who lived in this, or they went to the Chazal equivalent of the university and asked the scientist then to tell me how big the distances were. And this is what they thought, right? Because of this, I will not say with regard to the dicta of theirs, which as we find corresponds to the truth, that they were incorrect or have been said fortuitously. I'm not going to bother telling you that they were wrong because they weren't wrong. Based on what they knew, that was the best of their knowledge. Now we know better. Our mathematics are more advanced. So now we know different, right? They weren't teaching us anything that comes from Tanakh. So for whenever it is possible to interpret the words of an individual in such a manner that they conform to a being whose existence has been demonstrated, if you can show me something that Chazal say that does conform to reality, great, right? That's fine. That's wonderful. It's always better to do that when you can. But this is the conduct that is most fitting and most suitable for an equitable man of excellent nature. If you're a decent, a normal, intelligent human being, if a person could respond, and then you say yes, because it's better to say don't say that Chazal were wrong, just say that they did it based on the best knowledge that they had available at the time. And this paragraph of the Rambam is one which is, of course, became very famous in the famous Rabbi Natan Slifkin affair, where he was attacked for writing this basic idea that the Rambam emphatically states and very clearly states over here that when Chazal state scientific facts, they're stating it based on the best knowledge that they had available to them at the time. And they weren't, in fact, and as the Rambam just stated here, it's respectful of us not to say that they were wrong, but it's much more respectful of us to say that they said what they knew based on the best of their knowledge. And this is the Rambam's approach. We came across hints to this several times, but here's where he says it most clearly and most emphatically that it's okay for me to disagree with Chazal's distances. So the point of this chapter was, there was 2 points. The main point and this little tangent that he just went on. The main point being that the awesome vastness of the universe should impress us to the fact that we as human beings cannot possibly be the purpose of existence, right? And the second idea was this idea that don't bother me with contradictions between my science and the science of Chazal in the Gemara. I'm going to open the floor before I do chapter 15 to questions or comments.
I'd like to ask about the most base and vile. I mean, if you start from that presumption, assessment,
yeah,
that where humans are base and vile,
yeah.
Where does he come up with that conclusion? I didn't see.
Well, what he really means there is first of all vile in comparison to the great intellects that run the heavens. Right. And in the sense that we have this matter. Remember a couple chapters ago, I forget which one, he talked about how human beings are made of form and matter. And because our matter is dirt, right? So we therefore sometimes tend to go after those things that are our matter desires, our physical desires and so on. And so in that sense, we're vile. And he says the way we're supposed to perfect that is with our intellect.
But if he had access to the periodic table and atomic theory and atoms and neutron and electron, maybe he wouldn't think of us as dirt. But
no, because remember, he had 4 elements, right? Right. If he obviously the idea, the question of what the Rambam would have said if, right? Everyone loves to say that. And every group of Jews that has ever existed since the Rambam passed away claimed, with the exception of those who criticized him, for a little bit. But once he achieved status as in the pantheon, well, that's not the right word, in the canon of Jewish world, right? Every group claims to have the Rambam as the guy that they back. I mean, if you talk to a guy in Chabad, they would swear that the Rambam would be following the Rebbe or something. If you talk to a guy in, the Reform movement,
But the Rambam would wake up from his dead and say that what you follow the Rebbe, calling him the Mashiach, is exactly the opposite of what I said in the Laws of Kings.
all right, well, I don't disagree, but every movement within Judaism, from all the way to the right to all the way to the left, claim the Rambam as their own. So what he would have said is a very difficult question, but I don't think it would be. I think it's pretty accurate to say that and the Rambam emphatically always follows where the evidence leads him. So if there's scientific evidence that something is true, the Rambam would absolutely accept it. And he stated that over and over again, right? If there's something that either through logic has to be true or through scientific experiment has been demonstrated, that's what the Rambam uses when his equivalent of experiment. Obviously, he was pre-scientific revolution, so it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to him as it means to us, but something that has been demonstrated to be true, right? The Rambam would absolutely accept that. He would never say, "Oh, that science is not true because of something." That I think that's pretty clear. And in regard to how he approaches when Chazal make mistakes in science, he just made it eminently clear. Despite this, I have heard on so many occasions people claim that the Rambam doesn't say this, and it's mind-boggling. Right, because they can't accept that the Ram. Why don't just admit that he says what he says, and you don't like it, fine, or quote somebody else and say you agree with the other guy. But to deny what the Rambam said is, to me, it's sacrilegious. I mean, it's just, this is what he said. If you don't like it, that's your problem. But anyway, regardless, this is. So this is the foundation of understanding. Like, if Chazal understood things scientifically in any way, and we now know it's not that way. This Rambam just told us exactly what we're supposed to do with that contradiction. And that's what the purpose of this book is, the guide for the perplexed, right? Thus, people that want to believe in the Torah don't want to let go of the Torah because we believe in it. But we also find contradictions and problems. And this is one of those problems, when science scientific fact contradicts what our rabbinic leadership and that teach us. Okay. So anyway, so let's hit chapter 15. On page 459. Chapter 15 is a addresses the impossible. So if you don't mind, I want to go off on a little tangent. I have to give credit where credit is due. And I mentioned this a long time ago, probably well over a year ago. I mentioned this podcast that I like to listen to sometimes called Judaism Demystified. And a year or two ago, they had a guy named Rabbi Matt Schneeweiss, who I was introduced to in this podcast. I didn't know, and he doesn't claim to be an expert philosopher or anything, but he has some cool lectures that he's given on the topic of, can God do the impossible, right? So it was just it's a really fun, mind-bending, mind-twisting podcast if you want to listen to it. But I want to give him credit because a lot of my understanding of this issue came from that podcast. So the question is, if something is impossible, scientifically impossible, can God do it? Okay, can God do it? So the famous question is, the one that the philosophers debated over the centuries was it comes in two famous forms. One is, can God make a triangle in which the diagonal is the equidistant to the sides, right? Can God make such a triangle, right? So the Rambam will mention that particular one. The other question is, can God make a rock that is impossible for him to too heavy for him to lift, right? So you get cognitive dissonance just thinking about this question, right? Because if God makes if you say that God can't make such a triangle or can't make such a rock, then you're limiting God, right? Because you're saying he can't do something, right? If you say that he can do it, then he makes a rock that's immovable. Now there's something that God can't do because he can't move the rock, right? So it's you get into this mind bending thing. So I'm going to make a few. So Billy, you said the question is nonsensical, and thank you for saying that, and you're 100% right. And I'm gonna say that in a minute, basically. So I appreciate you jumped ahead of me, but so there's several responses that we need to understand to that question that are just simple logic, right? And they're not. These are not religious ideas. These are philosophical ideas. But they're very relevant to what we're about to learn in the Rambam. And I'm going to tell you right now that Rambam is about to tell us emphatically, and you can even see it in just the first few sentences if you look, that the answer according to the Rambam is no, right? God cannot do the impossible. And it's going to step into philosophical questions too, right? Like more than just can he make this mythical rock or a triangle, right? But it goes into more foundational questions of the nature of God himself, which we'll get to soon. So the 4 points that I want to make, and I got these directly from this Rabbi Schneeweiss, are as follows. The first thing is that perfection. Why do we have a problem when we ask this question, right? What's the problem with this question? Because either way, we're limiting God, right? We're making a limitation. We're making him somehow less, somehow worse, somehow less perfect, right? If we limit him, and since we have this notion that we can't limit him, right? Therefore, the question it confuses us because we can't have an answer. So he said, however, if you think about it, even when you call God perfect, you're making a limitation, because if he's perfect, then he can't be imperfect. So you just made a limitation, right? So limiting God and saying that he can't do the impossible is not a limitation. It's impossible, right? Right? It's simply impossible. So you can't so that's the first thing that you need to know, right? The second thing that you need to know is that it's the question itself is absurd, right? So in another example that philosophers like to play with is the following, and it kind of this question, you can illustrate it a little better. What happens if an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, right? So again, your mind is bent. So the thing is like this: the question is in itself a paradox, right? The question is totally nonsensical, right? Because which is really what Billy was saying, right? And that is, why is that? Because if the unstoppable force could move the immovable object, right, then it's not an immovable object, right? If the unstoppable force can't move the immovable object, then it's not an unstoppable force, right? So you don't have to answer a question that makes no sense in the first place, right? So it's the same thing when you ask such questions about God. Can God do the impossible, right? The question itself is a paradox, right? So the whole question falls away, so there's no purpose in answering it. The third point that he made, and you'll see what I mean, all these 4 points will help us when we go through this chapter, that the answer is no, he can't do the impossible. Why? Because if he could do the impossible, then it wouldn't be impossible. It's possible, right? So he gave the example. Imagine you have two big giant buckets. In one bucket, you throw the impossible things, and the other bucket, you throw the possible things, right? And the triangle is in this weird triangle is in the impossible, and this big rock and these immovable objects, they're all in the impossible box. And then God does it. Well, now it's not impossible anymore, so it goes into the possible box, right? So the question is nonsensical in the first place, right? And the fourth point he makes is that, and this is also really important, is that what we seem to think that when we say you can't do something, and he said, makes this as a psychological point. When we're children, right, and we want to do something, and our mom says no, you can't, right? We think that that's bad, right? When someone says you can't do something, well, that you're limiting, right? You're limiting. That's a bad thing. He says that's just, it's this childish psychological idea that sits in our brains our entire lives, that we think when you say something that someone can't do something, that's a limitation, that's somehow making somebody less powerful, less good, less perfect. But it's not true. A limitation that's based on something being impossible, that's not bad. It's just impossible. It's like if your mom tells you you can't, fly to I mean, nowadays maybe you could fly to Mars, but you can't fly to Pluto, right? It's impossible. Maybe one day they'll figure out technology, but right now you can't, right? So it's not a limitation. It's just a fact, right? So anyway, those are 4 points that I think are important to see, because then now we're going to see Rambam's discussion of can God do the impossible. So the impossible, Rambam says, is a stable nature. In other words, when it's a rule of nature that this is impossible. One whose stability is constant and is not made by a maker. It is impossible to change it in any way. It's not impossible because God made it impossible, but otherwise it's just scientifically, it's just impossible, right? And the reason why, in theory, right, because Rambam believes in a creator and things are impossible usually because of a scientific rule that says that such a thing is impossible, such as the scientists of geometry saying that such a triangle is impossible, right? It's conceivable that God could have created a different universe in which the rules of science would have been different, right? That might be conceivable. However, right, you'll see in a minute why the Rambam is saying that the impossible is impossible because it's impossible, and it's not because God made it this way, right? Because hence, and the power over the maker of the impossible is not attributed to the deity. It's not impossible because God made it impossible. It's impossible because it is. Now, it might sound a little on the edge for a minute, but hold with the Rambam for a minute, because you'll understand it soon. This is a point about which none of the men of speculation differs in any way. And none but those who do not understand the intelligibles is ignorant of this. The people that don't get this are just ignorant, right? Which is, we've heard the Rambam dismiss people like that before. The point about which there is difference of opinion among all the men of speculation concerns a certain species of imaginable things. People do argue over certain things that you can imagine, and then you wonder, is this really possible or is this really impossible, right? With regard to which one of the men says they belong to the class of impossible things, regarding which that power to change them cannot be attributed to the deity. So in other words, since they're impossible, they're impossible. Whereas the other says, no, it belongs to the class of possible things, depending on the power of the deity to be brought into existence when he wills. In other words, I think this is possible and you think it's impossible. We can argue about that. You and I can come up with is it possible for a human being to run a certain speed that whatever? So you could say it's impossible. I could say it's possible, and then we could debate it, right? But if it's actually impossible, then it's impossible. Thus, for example, the coming together. Now, the next thing Rambam is going to list scientific rules that you and I are familiar with because we've been studying this book together. But these are not scientific rules that are based on modern science. They're scientific rules based on Aristotelian science. So I'm just going to go through them quickly. But one of them is relevant. The coming together of contraries at the same instance, like something being hot and cold at the same time, right? Or something being fast and slow at the same time. It can't. They're opposites. And at the same place in transmutation substance. I mean, the transformation of a substance into an accident. Remember, an accident. I don't like the term accident. And by the way, in the new translation, they still use the term accident, the one that you guys sent me. But I have been starting to use it. It's absolutely wonderful, by the way. And I've used it a lot of the notes. They're just really, it's really good. And the only reason why I'm not using it is because everyone in this class bought this, and because this is the one that I'm used to. But I have been using it as a reference. But I use, instead of accident, as a characteristic, right? So in Aristotelian philosophy, a substance is made of something, and then certain characteristics are intrinsically combined with it to make it into the thing, right? That it is. So you can't have something without a characteristic. Everything. So the dirt has this characteristic. It feels a certain way. It's a certain moisture or whatever it is. The table has a certain character. You can't have the substance of the table without the characteristics, the accidents that attribute to it, or the existence of a corporeal substance without there being an accident in it. All these things belong to the class of the impossible, right? Because they defy the rules of science as was known to the Rambam in his day, right? So likewise, so now here's the key sentence now. So why is it that even God didn't make things impossible, right? Not because he couldn't have made a different universe with different scientific rules, but because what things are truly impossible, the following things. God should bring into existence someone like himself. Can God create another God? Let's say God decided, I'm getting lonely, I want there to be another God. Could God do that, right? Or should annihilate him. Let's say God says, you know what, I'm sick and tired of all of this. I want to not exist anymore, right? So let's say God wants to annihilate himself. or should become a body, or God should say, I'm not going to be a God anymore. I want to be a person now, right? This is a direct shot at a certain religion, right? I mean, and the commentaries note that. But it's incomprehensible. It's philosophically inconceivable because God is beyond this universe. He's something other, something different. He can't become a body, right? Or should change, or God should somehow decide to change his nature in some way, shape, or way. All of these things belong to the class of the impossible. And the power to do any of these things cannot be attributed to God. We can't say that God could do any of these things. Now, why is it? What do these four things have in common? All those four things, right? What they have in common is that they fundamentally, right? If God could make another God, like if you would posit that if God decided to make another one, then he could, then God wouldn't be God anymore, right? Because the whole concept of God is the unity of God. There's only one, right? You could, if you decide to be a polytheist and believe in 10 gods, fine, go be a polytheist, right? But assuming that you're accepting the premise of this monotheistic religion that we're studying here, right? Then once you posit logically that God could make another one, then you're not believing in God anymore, right? Then there's no, then you just eliminated the concept of God, right? The same thing with annihilate himself. God always is, always was, always will be. That's a central tenet of what the definition of God is. So if God were to make a time when he's no longer around, right, then he's not God, right? And the same thing with the third one, right? If the whole point of God is that he's completely, is that he's a concept that you and I cannot comprehend, right? We a human being, our human mind can't comprehend God because he's of a totally different substance, something that we can't even imagine, right? So if he could become a man, if he could become some body in this in this underworld that we live in, then he wouldn't be God. Or if God could change, the whole point of God is that he's immutable, he's not unchangeable, he doesn't change, he always is, always was, so on and so forth. So any of those things are impossible, and they're not impossible because God said one day, right, this is going to be impossible, right? They're impossible because if they did exist, then there wouldn't be God, right? Then God wouldn't be who he is. So the very essence of God says that God cannot do those things. So if something is absolutely impossible, which are those four things that he just mentioned, then they're just impossible because they are. And that's the point that Rambam is trying to make. Okay, so regarding the question whether he is able to bring into existence an accident that exists alone, not in a substance. See, these are going back to the argument about those scientific rules, right, that he had, right? Or namely, a group among the men of speculation, namely the Mutazila, some Islamic thinker group, a philosophical school, they have imagined this and held that it is possible, or others have asserted that it is impossible. It is true that those who assert that an accident may exist without a substance, they're not led to this affirmation by speculation alone, but they wish to safeguard thereby certain doctrines of the law that are violently rebutted by speculation. Thus, the assertion in question was a way out for them. And it doesn't pay to go into the arguments of these philosophers. So, but he's basically saying, so they argue that it is possible, and the others argue that it's not possible, right? Similarly, the bringing into the being of a corporeal thing out of no matter whatsoever belongs, according to us, to the class of the possible, right? We think that it is possible to create the world yesh me'ayin because God did it, right? It's not something that you or I can do, right? It's like if you had if prior to creation, right? That sentence obviously is nonsensical to Maimonides, but I'm going to say it anyway. You had these two buckets, and in one bucket it said make something out of nothing, right? So that was in the impossible bucket until the Big Bang, or whatever you want to call the moment of creation, right? Now, all of a sudden, it's possible because God just did it. So it's not in the impossible bucket, right? So the philosophers say similarly that to bring into being a square whose diagonal is equal to one of its sides, that's the thing that I said before, or a corporeal angle encompassed by four angles or other similar things, belong, all of them, to the class of the impossible. Some of those who are ignorant of mathematics and concerning these matters know only the words by themselves and do not conceive of their notion, think that they are possible. So the Rambam is saying those other things that are impossible because they violate the basic laws of nature, like the diagonal of a triangle, are impossible because they are. Would that I knew whether this gate is open and licit, so that everyone can claim and assert with regard to any notion. I just started the second paragraph on 460. So regarding any notion, whatever that he conceives, this is possible, whereas someone else says, no, this is impossible because of the nature of the matter, right? Right? The fact is that I don't know, right? The Rambam is saying, right? I don't know the answer to every single one of these questions, right? Which is possible and which is not. Or is there something that shuts and blocks this gate so that a man can assert decisively that such and such a thing is impossible because of its nature? Should this be verified and examined with the help of the imaginative faculty or with the intellect, right? Do we try to imagine such things, and if we can imagine them, then they must be possible, or do we think it through? The intellect meaning, do we scientifically think it through, logically think it through, and see if it will work? And by what can one differentiate between that which is imagined and that was cognitive in the intellect? If you can dream something, I can dream about a dragon flying through a rainbow and a butterfly, or I can dream all kinds of things. How does that match up with what's real? What could happen? Could there be a dragon? Could it fly through a rainbow? I don't know, right? For an individual, sometimes disagrees with someone else or with himself. We disagree with ourselves. One day I think it's possible. The next day I think it's impossible. With regard to a thing that isn't been impossible, that he asserts that it is possible, whereas the objective, the other guy says this assertion that it is possible, and the other guy says you're using your imagination, you're dreaming this up, it can't be, right? And not due to consideration by the intellect, right? You can think about any argument you've had with any intractable argument you've had with anybody, where one guy said, and it all bounces around this, and the other guy says, it can't be, it's not true, the data doesn't back it up, right? Is that something altogether outside both the intellect and the imagination, or is it completely unimaginable? Or is it by the intellect itself that one distinguishes between that which is cognized by the intellect and that which is imagined? All these are points of investigation which may lead very far. If you want to go down those paths, go right ahead, right? You have my permission, the Rambam says, to spend all the time you want and debate whatever subject you want to debate and do whatever research you want to do. However, this is not the object of this chapter. I made my point, right? I'm not here to speculate on how to achieve world peace tomorrow or whatever else it is that you want to argue about. It has then become clear, and the Rambam ends this chapter as follows. It has then become clear that according to every opinion in school, there are impossible things whose existence cannot be admitted. The bottom line is, if something is impossible, then it really is, right? Power to bring them about cannot be ascribed to the deity. We cannot say that God can do it, right? And now if you think back to those arguments that I stated, right, the Rambam is emphatically saying that to say, right, that God can't do impossible things is not in any way, shape, or form a limitation or deficiency in God. The fact that he does not change them signifies neither inability nor deficiency of power on his part, right? Right? Because don't think that because I said he can't do the impossible, that somehow that's a deficiency in God. It's not a deficiency. It's just impossible, right? Accordingly, they are necessarily as they are and are not due to the act of an agent. It has then become clear that the point with regard to which there is disagreement concerns the things that could be supposed to belong to either of two classes, and either the things that we could debate are which things are really impossible, right? So I don't know, nowadays, maybe some theoretical physicist can explain how you can make a triangle with maybe somebody can, maybe somebody can't, I don't know. Certainly according to basic geometry, it's impossible. Whether they belong to the class of the possible or to the impossible, learn this. So just learn this, right? And now you can go and argue with whoever you want to, however long you want to. Be my guest, have a good time, right? But don't bother God with all this nonsense. And so this is the end of this chapter, which I personally thought was a lot of fun. But you're going to see this entire third book. I promise. Every single one is full of gems. So yeah, looking forward to seeing you guys next week. But if there's any questions or comments, then now's the time.
Yeah, I have a comment. That there's a listener to this. I've been spending the last 20 minutes trying to figure out when you said a square, a triangle, which is equal to one of its sides. But I see the quote here from Maimonides. He was talking about a square. Whose diagonal is equal to one of its sides.
Yeah, but it's the same thing. If you remember basic geometry, a square that you draw a diagonal, you just made two triangles. It's the same.
So it's the diagonal of the square that is equal to one of the sides of the square, not that the diagonal of the triangle is equal to one of the sides. I couldn't figure out when you said a diagonal.
I was using the triangle thing because when you read through a lot of the when you read all basic philosophy books, they love to debate this question, right?
Oh, okay. And
So
so
some use the triangle example, and some use it's the same question though, because if you have a square, right, and then you draw a triangle, a line through it, and you just
diagonal of a square. I understand what
right,
a diagonal of a square is, but I didn't understand what a diagonal of a triangle was. What is a diagonal of a triangle?
It's the long line. If I'm using the wrong geometric term, forgive me.
I see. That was the okay.
The long line that's longer by definition than the shorter line.
The size of the triangle. I see. Okay. Thank you.
Right. No problem. Yeah, Jeff.
Hi. I was thinking about this idea that God can't change himself, right, as an impossibility.
Right.
And then I was thinking the idea that God is one.
Mm-hmm.
One of the understandings of God is one is that everything is God. Everything that exists is God, right? This idea of the unity of the universe is God. And so if God were to change himself in one of those ways that's suggested, it seems to me that would then entail it would no longer be the same universe, right? The whole universe would be different. Like this reality wouldn't be here anymore because God would have changed, and if God changes, then everything changes.
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that you're starting with one mistake, right? And that is
if it's just one, I'm very impressed.
No, but it's one that leads to others. The Rambam doesn't use that terminology describing everything as God. That's the idea certainly exists within Judaism, right? Especially in the mystical schools, right? But some find some hints of like a little bit of a pantheism. Like Spinoza also took that idea to a large degree from Rambam and then ran with it in a different direction. But that the concept that everything is God is just, it's not really a Maimonidean concept. So and the Rambam doesn't deal with the big question that which is really the foundation that kicked off the Kabbalistic movement, right? Which is, right, if God, right, how could there be existing things that exist that are not God, right? So how could we exist? And the concept of tzimtzum and things like that, and that's what really gave birth to the Kabbalah. But Rambam doesn't really deal with that question. He doesn't seem to have a problem with the fact that the universe that we live in is separate from God. The way the Rambam sees it is God is a creator who made it all, right? And is the ultimate power that runs it all. And he described how God's emanations through the various spheres, emanate from one sphere to the next sphere to the next sphere until it gets down to us and is the energy that powers it all. But he doesn't seem to have a problem with the fact that we're separate. So that's the mistake. And it's just not, it is a very pervasive and important idea in Judaism, but it's not really a Maimonidean idea. So I kind of pulled the water out of your question. Pulled the carpet out from under it.
I was just trying to square the circle, so to speak.
Yeah, but sometimes we can't, like there are circles in Jewish thought that can't be squared, because these are different schools of thought. When people think that we just heard today, this idea, what's the fundamental idea, what's the purpose of the universe, right? So we have a Sadia Gaon or Rabbeinu Bachya on one side and Rambam on the other side, certainly all extremely important figures in the history of Jewish thought, saying completely opposite ideas, when people joke around, what's the purpose of the universe? Well, if it's not being asked as a joke, it's a serious question, and they have two very different answers. I want to mention Rambam's answer is important for a lot of reasons, and it's going to become more and more important as we read through book 3. It's important because, first of all, Rambam explained to us today, it doesn't make sense to say that this entire universe exists just for us. But more than that, because of the Maimonidean concept of God, because Rambam emphasizes so much that we can't affect God, it also doesn't make sense. And he's going to say this later. I can't remember which chapter, but that it doesn't make sense that he would create a world for the purpose of us worshiping him, because what does God need our worship for, right? He doesn't gain anything from us, right? So why would he make a world simply in order that we should something? So the Rambam says, you don't ask such questions, right? He told us, he told us in chapter 13, do not ask that question, right? Right? It's not a question, what's the purpose? God decided to make a world. That's it. We don't need to know the purpose, right? We will never know the purpose. He made the world the way it is, right? Deal with it, right? And do the right thing, because we have this intellect that we're supposed to use and live in a certain way. But that's not the reason why God made the world, right? You know, Rambam, that was 12 and 13 where he emphasized that. So, but Rabbeinu Bachya would give you a very different answer, right? And the Sadducean would give you a very different answer. They would say, no, the world was created so that the human beings should come and worship God, and that we should live this Torah lifestyle and worship and pray and do mitzvot and everything. That's why this world was created. Imagine, though, the different conclusions that you make when you look at the rest of the world that's around you. Whether you take a Maimonidean approach versus a Rabbeinu Bachya approach, and you get a very different approach to the world, you know. And remember, again, it's just fascinating how the Rambam admits, he throws in these little things. And I know you can find some verses that sound like those other guys, but don't worry, I got it, you know, because he already gave us instructions about how to learn those verses.
Well, can I just ask, the thing you just mentioned in passing is very fundamental. I mean, what difference does it make? Well, since we have the Torah, it really doesn't make any difference. But is that the reason it doesn't make any difference?
Because we have the Torah?
Because of the Torah, it tells us how to live. And what more do we need to know than how to live?
Need to know how to live, but not why we're living.
But Maimonides is saying that's not a question we should ask. Why?
Because the answer to why is ultimately always going to be the same, because God willed it so, right? God made the universe how it is because he decided to do it. We will never be able to know why he decided to do it. He could just as easily have continued existing and not made a world, right? But he decided to make, or he could have made a world different than the one we see. But he made this one. And asking the question of why he decided to do it is, we'll never know the answer. So just don't bother, you know.
Well,
we can go back to the quotes.
We'll return to that, why that's relevant. For example, if God, some people say God needed a companion, so it makes a difference. If you think you're a companion to God, it gives you a certain status that otherwise would be lacking.
Just remember what the Rambam said in the beginning of 13. Often the minds of perfect men have grown perplexed over the question of what is the final end of that which exists, right? Then he went on a whole long thing which took us 2 weeks to do. And in the end, he said, let me find that. I want to find that sentence. Thus it says that the Lord had made everything lema'anehu, right? First, the would be for the sake of his essence may be exalted. That is, for the sake of his will, as the latter is his essence, according to what has been made clear in the treatise, right? There's one sentence I want to remember. Thus we are obliged to believe that all that exists was intended by him according to his volition, and we shall seek for it no cause or other final end whatever. Just as we do not seek for the end of his existence may be exalted, so we do not seek for the final end of his volition, right? His will, right? According to which all that has been and will be produced in time comes into being as it is. And be not misled in your soul to think that the spheres and angels have been brought into existence for our sake. I mean, that was a couple of weeks ago we read that.
What page was that? What was the page of that?
450, bottom of 454 and top of 455. And that was his conclusion when he started several pages prior asking the big question, right? The question of what is the final end of that which exists. So his answer is not for you. And because God decided to make a world like this, right? Anyway, any other comments before we close up? All right, so looking forward to next week. All right,
This is great. Thank you.
no, you're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you for joining. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right.